The wind didn't just blow across the plains, it stole. It took the warmth from a man's bones and the hope from his heart, leaving only cold, jagged emptiness in its wake. For Elias, the wind was a constant companion, like a voice he'd come to understand, the low moan that promised a coming frost, the sharp whistle that warned of dust storms. His small, stubborn ranch tucked against the endless prairie was his refuge, his fortress. Built by his own hands, every log and stone a wall against the world, a world he'd long since turned his back on. The cabin inside was simple, sparse. A single cot, a weathered table with one chair, a cold hearth that mirrored the cold in his chest. Nothing more. His days had become rituals, a sequence of tasks that stretched from the first hint of light to the deep shadows of twilight. He had cattle to tend, fences to mend, and soil to fight. It was a penance, a life born from a failure that had refused to stay buried. The memory of that night, of fire and smoke, of promises broken, hovered over him like a storm, never quite leaving, always waiting for the moment when silence grew loud enough to break him. He never went to town, not unless he had to. The settlement of Copper Creek was no more than a collection of mud tracks and dilapidated buildings, a place that stank of desperation. But this time, he had no choice. The flour bin was nearly empty. The wind was whispering of winter's approach. He hitched the horse to the wagon and set off toward the town. The journey was slow. Every mile felt like a descent into something darker. The ranch, with its clean, unbroken silence, was far behind him now. Elias knew what awaited him in town. Dusty faces, tired eyes, men who had long forgotten the weight of hope. But it was what he saw near the livery stable that caught his attention. A small crowd, gathered in grim silence, no shouts, no boasts, just a hushed, uneasy quiet. Elias, instincts told him to turn away, to ignore what was happening, to keep his focus on the general store. But something stopped him. There, in the center, standing on the back of a wagon, was Finn. A man who looked like he'd been carved out of a life full of cheap whiskey and broken dreams. He was auctioning off what he called cargo, but Elias knew it was more than that. He knew it before his eyes even landed on her. She stood there, small and still, swallowed by a faded pink prairie dress that looked out of place in the dirt of Copper Creek. Her face was a mask, too calm, too quiet. And in her eyes, Elias saw something that hit him harder than he expected. Fear. The kind of fear that gripped a soul and never let go. She was Chinese, sold off like some kind of exotic animal, a piece of freight to be bought and owned. Elias tried to look away, but his gaze locked onto hers. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. She stared straight ahead, her gaze empty, lost. She wasn't the first to be sold this way, and she wouldn't be the last. But for some reason, this time, Elias couldn't turn his back. His stomach churned, his insides twisting with a memory he couldn't escape, a memory of Sarah. He had failed her. He had failed his son Thomas in the fire that had taken everything. That night he had promised Sarah he would protect their boy. He hadn't. And so he had locked himself away, a prisoner of guilt. But now he could do something. He could stop this. He could save her. Elias pushed through the crowd. His movements were slow, deliberate, and the men around him stepped back. He didn't negotiate. He didn't speak. He simply walked up to the wagon and laid down $20 silver. It was more than anyone had hoped for, more than a life was worth in a town like Copper Creek. Finn's eyes gleamed with greed, but he said nothing. The crowd muttered. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias had bought her. He had just paid for a human being like he would pay for a sack of flour. The weight of it hit him hard, burning his skin, gnawing at his insides. But there was no turning back now. The wagon ride back to the ranch was slow, the silence between them heavier than anything Elias had carried before. Maylee, for that was the name he learned later, sat stiffly beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at him, didn't speak. Elias couldn't stop staring ahead, focusing on the endless horizon. The weight of his decision pressed down on him, suffocating him. But he didn't know what else to do. The cabin, the ranch, his whole life, had been built around running from ghosts. And now, here he was, bringing another ghost into the fold. What had he done? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the wagon's wheels creaking, the rhythmic jingle of the harness. Mei Li didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. Elias couldn't understand her, and he didn't know what to say to her. He had no answers for himself, let alone her. When they reached the ranch, dusk was settling over the land. The sky was bruised, painted in shades of purple and orange. Elias stopped the wagon, the silence hanging thick between them. Mei Li didn't move. She didn't even glance at the cabin. Elias cleared his throat, the sound rough. "We're here." His voice felt foreign, like he hadn't used it in years. He climbed down from the wagon and opened the cabin door, lighting a lantern inside. He turned back to her, but she hadn't moved. Her eyes were fixed on the small wooden cabin, and Elias saw something there, something he didn't know how to interpret. Fear, apprehension, or maybe just resignation. Finally, he stepped toward her, the air between them colder than the winter wind. He gestured to the second room he'd built years ago, a space he had imagined for a future that never came. It held a small bed frame, a single window covered in dust. He set her small cloth-wrapped bundle down on the floor. "This is your room," he said. The words sounded hollow, but it was all he could offer. "No one will bother you here. You are safe." Safe. The word felt like a lie, and yet it was all he had to give. The next days blurred into a rhythm that felt like slow strangulation. Elias woke before dawn, the cold wooden floor creaking beneath his boots, the silence of the cabin as heavy as the weight in his chest. Every movement seemed mechanical, each task done out of habit rather than necessity. The cattle needed feeding, the fence needed mending, and the barn needed repair. But the endless cycle of work didn't fill the emptiness inside him. It only pushed him further into the isolation he had spent so long constructing. Mei Li, for her part, had remained a silent presence in the house. Elias couldn't remember the last time he had heard her speak. She never entered the main room unless it was to clean or tend to the small tasks he never asked her to do. She wasn't a servant, he told himself. He hadn't bought her to replace Sarah. He had simply done what he could to ease his conscience, to quiet the ghosts that had followed him for so long. But every time he looked at her, every time she slipped away to her room after completing some task, Elias could feel the distance between them growing wider. One morning, after a long stretch of work outside, Elias returned to the cabin to find a small pot of coffee simmering on the hearth, the air thick with its earthy scent. The fire crackled, casting soft shadows across the room. He stood there for a moment, staring at the simple act of kindness. Mei Li's presence had become a quiet undercurrent in his life, always there, always just out of reach. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for her. And yet, the small acts of care were starting to fill in the cracks in the walls of his heart, like water creeping through the stone of a dam, soft but relentless. He sat at the table and took the coffee she had made. The warm liquid hit his stomach like a small shock of comfort. The routine felt normal, the way it had before his life had been shattered, before the fire had claimed everything he had known. But as the days passed, the air between him and Mei Li began to change, though neither of them spoke of it. It wasn't love. It wasn't friendship. It was something else. Something unspoken that grew heavier the longer they both stayed silent. One evening, as the first hint of winter chill began to settle in, Elias was mending a tear in his shirt, his rough hands working at the fabric as his mind wandered. The sounds of Mei Li's quiet humming drifted from the other room. It was an old song, something from her homeland, and it touched something deep inside him. For the first time, he found himself listening to her voice, not out of obligation or guilt, but because he couldn't stop himself. It was haunting. A soft, fragile melody that seemed to carry the weight of all the things she had lost, the things she had been forced to leave behind. He didn't know if it was the song or her voice, but it unsettled him. There was so much he didn't understand about her, so much he didn't want to understand. And yet, A part of him couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her than the woman he had bought, than the woman he had tried to save. The storm rolled in that night. A furious wind tore through the plains, shaking the walls of the cabin and howling through the cracks in the doorframe. Elias had already been outside once, securing the animals for the coming storm. He returned soaked to the bone, his body shivering with the bite of cold and exhaustion. The storm had taken over the land, a roiling black mass of clouds that seemed to swallow the world whole. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the fire wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. Mei stood at the hearth, her figure silhouetted against the flickering flames. Her presence, once a ghost in the house, now felt more tangible. She had a bowl of broth in her hands, the steam rising from it in soft curls. She turned as he entered, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like ages. Elias couldn't remember the last time someone had cared for him this way, without expectation, without obligation. Mei didn't ask for anything. She simply took care of him, in the quiet, subtle way that someone who had nothing else to give could. She handed him the bowl of broth, her hands steady, her gaze soft but distant. He took it without a word, sitting down at the table. She didn't sit across from him this time. Instead, she stood nearby, watching him with a careful expression, as if waiting for something. Elias couldn't place it, but there was a shift in her. Something that wasn't fear, wasn't resignation, but something else. For the first time, Elias realized just how much of her was locked away. "I don't know what to say to you," he said, his voice hoarse, thick with the weight of his unspoken thoughts. "I bought you because I didn't know what else to do." Mei didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence alone said more than words ever could. There was no accusation in her eyes, no resentment. Just a quiet acceptance. Elias took a deep breath, his chest aching. "I'm sorry," he muttered, though he wasn't sure who he was apologizing to. Her? Himself? The ghosts of his past? Mei didn't speak. She simply stood there, her gaze drifting to the fire, her body wrapped in the quiet rhythm of their shared silence. Elias ate the broth, the warmth spreading through his chest, but it wasn't enough. The cold that had settled in his heart was still there, and no amount of food or drink would chase it away. But it was something, an acknowledgement, however small, of the fragile connection that had begun to form between them. When the meal was over, he stood and went outside again, the storm howling around him. He checked on the cattle once more, though he knew there was little more he could do. When he returned, Mei was already in her room, her door closed. The house felt quieter than usual, like the storm outside had stolen the last remnants of sound. Elias stood in the middle of the room, staring at the empty chair where she had sat. His eyes fell on the small wooden horse on the mantel, the one he had carved for his son all those years ago. The weight of loss hit him again, deeper this time. For a moment, he thought he could hear Sarah's voice, the memory of it so clear it made his chest ache. But it was just the wind. The next morning, the storm had passed, but its presence lingered in the air, the world still and heavy. Elias rose early, the first light of dawn just beginning to creep over the horizon. Mei was already up, as usual. The fire was burning, the coffee pot simmering. He didn't ask her to do these things, she just did them. He looked at her as she worked, her hands steady as she moved around the room, her silence more a comfort than a reminder of what he had bought. The words he had spoken the night before felt like a confession, a mark of some kind of understanding between them, even if it wasn't clear yet what that understanding was. She hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't even asked to be saved. And yet he had tried to save her anyway. The days stretched on, each one blending into the next, with a monotony that felt both familiar and suffocating. Winter had settled in like an unwanted guest, and the land was slowly suffocating under the weight of snow. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a prison of sorts, a cage with two occupants who barely understood each other, yet were bound together by the simple fact of survival. Elias rose before dawn, as he had always done. The cold of the cabin was bone deep, and the fire had to be stoked early, its warmth fighting back the chill that crept through the walls. Mei was already up, a small figure moving silently around the room, her hands working with a practiced efficiency that spoke of a life lived in silence and restraint. Elias didn't know what she had lived through before arriving at his ranch, but he could guess. He could see it in the way she moved, careful, cautious, as if expecting someone to tear her life apart at any moment. But Elias wasn't that man. Not anymore. He'd been a man of action once, a man who believed he could protect those he loved. He'd failed, and now he was left with this fragile, strained silence that hung between him and the woman he had bought, a silent tension that neither of them knew how to break. They had settled into a routine of sorts. Elias would work outside in the cold, tending to the cattle, making sure the fences held against the weight of the snow. Mei would stay inside, keeping the fire stoked, the cabin clean. She'd cook when he returned, and they'd eat in silence, never speaking beyond the essentials. There was no affection between them, no friendship. It wasn't a marriage, though Elias had begun to wonder what it might become. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside, Elias was mending a fence near the barn. The snow had piled high, and the world beyond the ranch seemed muffled, as if it no longer existed. He was half finished when he saw her, Mei, standing in the doorway of the barn, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Elias had never seen her stand still like that before, her eyes not looking down at the ground but meeting his gaze directly. She was always in motion, always busy with something, cleaning, cooking, or working in the small garden he had once tended with Sarah. But now she was watching him, waiting for something. He paused, wiping his hands on his pants, and met her gaze. "Is there something you need?" he asked, his voice low, as if afraid to break the fragile stillness between them. For a moment, Mei didn't answer. She stood there, a figure framed by the cold, harsh light of the barn door, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I have a question," she said, her words broken but clear. Elias felt his heart tighten in his chest. He had been expecting something like this, but that didn't make it easier. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough. Mei's eyes flickered toward the ground for a moment, and then she raised her head again, her expression cautious. I want to learn," she said, "how to shoot, how to protect myself." Quote. Elias stared at her for a long moment, his heart pounding. She wanted to learn to shoot. The question caught him off guard, more than anything she had asked before. He had known she was strong, had known she had the quiet strength of someone who had survived much. But this was different. This wasn't about surviving. This was about fighting back. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, unsure of how to respond. What could he say? He had always been the one who protected, the one who made sure no one ever touched what was his. But now he wasn't sure what he was offering her. She wasn't his. She had never been his. And yet here she was, asking him to teach her how to defend herself, as if he were the one who had the answers. Finally, he nodded, though the gesture felt foreign to him. "All right," he said, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking slightly. "I'll teach you." The next morning, Elias led her to the far side of the barn, where his old hunting rifle was leaned against the wall. It was an old rifle, weathered and worn from years of use, but still reliable. He handed it to her, its weight, a reminder of the many years he had spent with that rifle in his hands, hunting, protecting. Mei took it carefully, her fingers trembling as she gripped the stock. Her eyes flickered to Elias, uncertainty written across her face. "You'll learn fast," Elias said, though the words felt hollow. He wasn't sure if he believed them. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder. He explained the sights, the trigger, the importance of patience. His hands, rough and calloused, adjusted her grip, and for a moment their fingers brushed. It was a simple touch, but it felt like an electric charge, a jolt that shot through his body. Her hands were small, delicate against the roughness of his, but her grip was steady, her gaze focused. She wasn't afraid. "Ready?" Elias asked, though his own voice shook as much as hers had. She nodded. The first shot rang out, loud and sharp against the stillness of the morning. The bullet missed, veering off to the left, but Mei didn't flinch. She didn't seem to care that she had missed. She simply adjusted the rifle, took another breath, and aimed again. The next shot was closer. Not perfect, but it was progress. By midday, Meili was hitting her targets with surprising accuracy. Elias watched her, his heart heavy with something he couldn't name. She was learning, yes, but there was something more to it. Something that went beyond the lessons of survival. He had spent so many years alone, so many years focused on his own grief, his own guilt. But now, as Meili stood there, shooting with a quiet intensity, Elias felt a shift inside him, like a dam breaking open, allowing something new to flow through the cracks. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was becoming stronger, and so too was he. The days that followed were marked by small victories. Meili continued to practice with the rifle, her skills improving with every shot. And as the winter deepened, so too did the bond between them. They didn't speak of it. They didn't need to, but in the quiet spaces between their words, in the small gestures of care that passed between them, filling the water trough, mending clothes, sharing a meal, they both began to understand something unspoken. They were no longer just two people stuck in the same place. They were becoming something else. They were becoming a team. Winter tightened its grip without mercy. Snow buried the plains until the horizon vanished, leaving the ranch stranded in a world of white and silence. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the cabin walls, rattling the shutters at night. Elias had lived through winters like this before. Alone. This time felt different. He was no longer the only heartbeat inside the storm. The days grew shorter. Darkness came early and lingered long after dawn should have arrived. Inside the cabin, the fire burned almost constantly. Meili kept it fed, her movements quiet and sure. Elias noticed how she conserved wood, how she learned the rhythm of the place as if she had always belonged to it. The ranch no longer felt like a fortress. It felt shared. They spoke more now, though never much. Simple words, practical words. The kind that didn't ask too much of either of them. Elias showed her how to read the weather by the wind's sound, how the snow piled differently when a hard freeze was coming. She listened closely, always listening, always remembering. One evening, as the storm pressed hard against the cabin, Elias came in late, his beard crusted with ice, his hands numb. Meili took his coat without asking and hung it by the fire. She handed him a cup of tea made from wild herbs she'd gathered months earlier and dried carefully. He drank it slowly. The warmth settled deep in his bones. He looked at her then. Really looked. She seemed stronger than when she had arrived. Not taller, not louder, but steadier. Her shoulders were straighter, her eyes clearer. The fear that once clung to her like a shadow had thinned, though it had not vanished. That was the night she finally asked. They sat at the table, the fire popping softly. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the silence felt heavier than usual. Meili's hands rested in her lap. She did not look at him at first. "Elias," she said carefully, testing his name again. Her voice was low, uncertain. "Yes," he answered. She swallowed. You bought me." The words were not an accusation, just a fact. His chest tightened. "Yes." She nodded once, staring at the grain of the table. "I need to know." A pause, a breath. "What do you want from me?" The question landed hard, harder than the wind, harder than any blow he'd taken in his life. He opened his mouth, closed it again. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Will I have to be for you?" Her English faltered there, the meaning heavy enough without perfect words. Like a wife, or to replace. Replace. The word tore straight through him. Elias pushed his chair back and stood abruptly. He turned toward the window, staring into the white fury outside. His hands shook. He clenched them into fists. "No," he said at last. The word came out rough, broken. "No." He stayed facing the storm. His voice dropped. "I had a wife. Her name was Sarah. And a son, Thomas." Saying their names felt like opening an old wound that had never healed. There was a fire. I wasn't there. I failed them. Behind him, he felt Meili listening, not moving, not interrupting. "What I did in that town," he went on, "buying you, it was wrong. I thought I was saving you. Truth is, I was trying to quiet my own ghosts." His breath fogged the glass. "You don't owe me anything, not work, not comfort, not your body, nothing." He turned slowly. Mei Li's eyes were wet, reflecting the firelight, but there was no fear in them now, only something raw, something searching. "You are safe here," Elias said again, and this time the words felt less like a lie. "And if you choose to leave one day, I won't stop you." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mei Li nodded, just once. "Thank you," she said softly. The storm eased by morning, leaving the world buried and silent. Elias rose early, his mind still heavy from the night before. When he stepped outside, the air was sharp and clean. The sky pale and endless. Mei Li joined him later, bundled in layers. Elias led her to the far edge of the barn where the rifle rested. "If you're staying," he said, "you should know how to protect yourself." She nodded. No hesitation this time. They spent hours practicing. Her shots grew steadier, her stance firmer. Each hit on the tin cans brought a small spark to her eyes. Elias felt something loosen inside his chest with every one. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon. Elias saw him first, a dark shape moving through the white. His body tensed immediately. The man rode closer, his horse tired, his face gaunt and sharp-eyed. Elias recognized him at once. Finn. The man dismounted near the edge of the yard, his gaze sliding past Elias and landing on Mei Li. A crooked smile crept across his face. "Seems you got comfortable," Finn said. "But there's a problem. That $20? It wasn't enough." Elias stepped forward, placing himself between them. "You made your deal." Finn spat into the snow. "Someone else offered more. Name of Silas. Big man. Mean man. He wants what he paid for." Mei Li did not hide behind Elias. She picked up the rifle. Finn noticed. His smile faltered. "You tell Silas," Elias said calmly, "that she's not for sale, and if he comes here, he won't leave the same way." Finn laughed, but it sounded thin, nervous. "We'll see." He mounted his horse and rode off, swallowed by the white. The silence that followed was worse than the storm. Elias looked at Mei Li. She met his gaze without fear. Trouble was coming. And they both knew it. The quiet didn't last long. The next day, Elias found himself pacing the porch, eyes scanning the horizon. The snow had begun to thaw slightly, though the grip of winter still clung to the land. Every sound outside felt like a threat, every shift in the wind a warning. Mei Li stayed inside, her presence like an anchor in the small cabin. But Elias knew. He could feel it deep in his gut. The storm wasn't over. Not yet. A few days passed without incident, but Elias didn't dare let his guard down. He kept the rifle close, checking the barn, the fences, the cattle, as if the simple tasks could distract him from the impending danger. But his mind always returned to the same place, Finn's warning, the shadow of Silas, the knowledge that something worse was coming. That afternoon, Elias was feeding the horses when he saw them, a trio of riders cutting across the plain, their horses kicking up plumes of snow with every step. The lead rider was unmistakable, Silas, his cruel face twisted into a sneer, eyes locked on the ranch like a predator closing in on its prey. Elias's heart dropped into his stomach. Behind Silas, two other men followed, both bulky, with hands hovering near their gun belts. They were men who knew how to take what they wanted and weren't afraid of what they left behind. Elias didn't move. He stood there for a moment, staring at the riders, his hand tightening around the pitchfork he had been using to feed the animals. The storm inside him was building, not with rage, but with something colder, something deeper, resolve. Mei Li had emerged from the cabin, her quiet steps soft in the snow, as if she too had sensed the coming danger. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Elias nodded once to her, a silent communication. The rifle was inside, but it didn't matter. They didn't need words now. They needed to stand together. Silas halted at the edge of the yard, his eyes scanning the cabin, then landing on Mei Li with that same greedy look Elias had seen before. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the snow. The two men with him followed suit, their postures tense, eyes darting between Elias and Mei Li. "I came to collect," Silas said, his voice dripping with malice. "You bought her, rancher. That's my property. You're not in a position to make demands." Elias's gaze was cold, hard. "She's not property. You made your deal. Now leave." Silas's sneer deepened. "I'll take what's mine, one way or another." He gestured to the men behind him who had already begun to circle the yard, spreading out like wolves looking for a weak spot. "You've got one choice. Hand her over, or we take her from you." Elias didn't flinch. "She's not for sale." At his side, Mei Li stood silent, but Elias could feel the shift in the air between them, a subtle, silent trust, a shared understanding. She wasn't just standing there to be taken, she was with him. Together. The tension snapped like the crack of a gunshot. The wind howled louder, a sound like an animal's cry. But it wasn't the wind that would decide the fate of this moment. Without a word, Silas reached for his pistol. Mei Li was faster. She fired. The shot rang out sharply, echoing across the empty plains. The bullet hit the ground in front of the right-hand rider's horse. The animal reared, shrieking in panic. Both henchmen froze, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but their eyes locked on the cabin. In the window, just inside the doorframe, Mei Li stood with the rifle leveled at them. Her body was steady, her eyes were calm. She had done exactly what Elias had taught her. The men hesitated, confused. They hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated a woman with the nerve to stand against them. Silas's face twisted in rage, but he didn't make a move. "Foolish woman," he spat. He pulled his pistol, pointing it at the cabin. He fired wildly. The shot went wide, splintering the wooden wall. The moment his focus shifted, Elias moved. With a roar, Elias lunged forward, not with the tines of the pitchfork, but with the long wooden handle, swinging it like a staff. The handle collided with Silas's wrist, sending the pistol flying into the snow. Silas grunted in pain, his face a mixture of surprise and fury. As he bent over to clutch his injured hand, Elias brought the handle back and slammed it into Silas's gut, knocking the wind out of him. The man crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. The second henchman recovered his wits and drew his gun. But before he could take aim, another shot rang out from the cabin. This one wasn't a warning. This shot tore through the man's shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of agony. He fell into the snow, clutching the wound, his fight gone. Silas stared up at Elias, his eyes wide with disbelief. The rancher and the woman he had bought weren't the broken victims he had imagined. They were fighters. The third man, seeing his partners defeated and his plan crumbling, spurred his horse around. He didn't need to see anymore. He fled, vanishing into the gray expanse of snow. The yard was still. The air was thick with the cold, with the aftermath of a fight that had left them standing, but not unscathed. Elias stood over Silas, the pitchfork steady in his hands, his breath coming fast from the adrenaline. The two men who had come from Mei Li were either bound or already fleeing. It was over, for now. Mei Li stepped out from the cabin, her rifle lowered but still held firmly in her hands. She walked toward Elias, her presence unshaken. Together, they were no longer two separate people, but a unit, stronger, scarred, and unbroken. Silas, still on the ground, glared at them, his bravado stripped away by the cold reality of defeat. "You think this is over?" he growled, his voice shaking with anger. "You think the likes of you can stand against men like me?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't need to. He turned to Mei Li, and for the first time in a long while he smiled. It was small, but real. They had survived. The storm had passed. But the battle was far from over. The days that followed the confrontation with Silas were filled with an uneasy quiet. The storm had passed, but the world outside still felt heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next challenge. The ranch, once a place of isolation and self-imposed punishment, now felt like a fragile sanctuary. Elias and Mei Li had faced their first test together and come out on the other side, not unscathed, but still standing, still fighting. The wound Silas had inflicted on their lives didn't disappear overnight. It lingered, a reminder of the world that lay beyond their ranch, a world filled with men who saw people like Mei Li as nothing more than property, to be bought and sold at will. Elias knew that even though Silas had retreated for now, the danger wasn't gone. It never really was. But something had changed. Between them. Mei Li had proven herself stronger than Elias had imagined. She had defended herself, defended them both. The quiet resilience she carried with her had been the spark that ignited his own resolve. For the first time in years, Elias found himself not just protecting someone, but truly standing beside her, shoulder to shoulder, against the world. That morning, the sky was clear, the sun cutting through the still air like a promise. Elias worked outside, splitting wood for the coming days, his movements methodical, each swing of the axe a beat in the rhythm of their shared life. Mei Li had already been to the well, and when she returned, she carried a basket of wild herbs she had gathered during her morning walk. She had learned to identify them all, some for healing, others for flavoring meals. She was no longer just a woman who had been bought. She had become a partner. A force of nature in her own right. As she placed the basket down on the porch, Elias looked up from his work and met her eyes. There was something different about the way they stood together now, something stronger, more certain. Mei Li smiled at him, the warmth in her eyes speaking volumes in the silence between them. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady. Elias didn't respond immediately. He simply watched her, the weight of everything that had passed between them settling over him. He thought of the day he had bought her, how he had seen her as an object, something to fill the hollow space left by Sarah and Thomas. But now, she was something else. Someone else. And he had come to realize that he had never truly been alone. Not really, not since she had arrived. "No," Elias said at last, his voice low and gravelly. "You saved me, Mei Li. You saved us both." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and true. They stood in silence for a moment, the warmth of the fire inside the cabin flickering through the windows. The world around them was still, quiet. The land was full of promise, of possibilities, and though the road ahead was uncertain, for the first time in a long time, Elias felt a flicker of hope. A hope that wasn't just about survival, but about something more, about a future they could build together. The next few weeks were filled with small, ordinary moments that felt extraordinary after all they had been through. The quiet hum of their daily lives began to take root, and Elias found himself teaching Mei Li more than just how to handle a rifle or tend the animals. He taught her how to plant a garden, how to grow vegetables in the harsh soil of the plains. They spent long hours together, the sun high in the sky, the sound of their laughter tentative at first but growing stronger as the days passed. One evening, as the light began to fade and the air cooled, Elias was out by the barn, repairing a broken fence. Mei Li came to him with a small bundle in her hands, a piece of cloth tied at the corners. She didn't speak at first, just stood there, holding it out to him. "What is it?" he asked, his brow furrowed in curiosity. She smiled, a soft, hesitant smile. "For you," she said. Elias took the bundle, untying the cloth carefully. Inside was a small, carved wooden horse, its edges smooth and worn from the touch of her hands. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Elias's chest tightened as he looked at the carving. He recognized it immediately. It was the same as the one he had made for Thomas, the one he had kept by the fireplace all these years, untouched by time and grief. He looked at Mei Li, his heart heavy with emotion. "It's for me," he whispered. She nodded, her eyes bright with something undefinable. "For us," she said quietly. Elias stood there for a long moment, the weight of the carving in his hands grounding him, steadying him. He had never expected this kind of peace, this kind of understanding. He had never imagined that the emptiness he had carried for so long could be filled again, not with the past, but with the present, with her. Mei Li stepped closer, standing by his side as they looked down at the small horse together. "We're a family now," Elias said quietly. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a lie. It didn't feel like a second choice. It felt true. As they walked back to the cabin, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The land stretched out before them, vast and untamed, but full of possibility. There was no telling what the future would bring, but they would face it together. The ranch, once a place of solitude and regret, had become a place of new beginnings. Together, they were no longer just surviving, they were living. And that, Elias realized, was worth more than anything else.